Okay, guys, we are coasting right along. Welcome to week 5. I am hopeful that you had an opportunity to listen to the morning prayer that I included with this week. I started that with the beginning of week 3. Okay, so at this point, we've reviewed the mood disorders as well as the anxiety disorders. And as you can see, we are understanding diagnoses based on classes of conditions. So for instance, mood related or anxiety based, right? And so now, as we move forward and hone your skills, I want you thinking about whether or not what you are hearing is somewhere in the mood spectrum or in the anxiety spectrum, okay? So once you are in the correct category, it makes it easier, I think, to sort of scroll through your mental Rolodex of issues and start to place the person and their story. Imagine that if you think that your client is anxiety ridden because you hear the common features of excessive fear and worry that are followed by some behavioral change that is outside of a developmental course or even a situational expectation, then it is easy to skip through those conditions versus the conditions of anxiety versus having no idea where the person is placed in the DSM. So again, I want you thinking in terms of disorder clusters. Is this mood? Is this anxiety? And then so on. And your options, when you do that, become limited and concentrated. You're listening for the key features. That plugs you into that grouping of disorders, and then you're just going through that grouping of disorders to figure out what's going on. So the question hopefully switches from what is going on with my client to, is this panic? Again, if it's an anxiety disorder, is this panic? Is this a specific phobia? Is this phobia related to a social issue? Is it separation if it's a child? Okay, so hopefully this way of thinking and categorizing will help you develop your confidence in hearing and then placing diagnostic symptoms. Today, we are concentrating our efforts on trauma and related disorders. At one point in our psychological history, trauma and anxiety were intermixed in the DSM. However, while they share the similar traits of fear and angst of things to come or anticipatory things, it was recognized that the fear response was not outside of context, right? For anxiety, there is a fear response that is disproportional to what is actually happening. With trauma, it was recognized that the fear was not disproportional and out of context. Instead, it was intended to be protective. Additionally, it was recognized that the fear was an expected response to the circumstance. However, the extended nature of the response, the trauma response, outside of the context of the trauma stimuli is what helped to create this constellation of symptoms as a disorder. Again, if a person is attacked, we imagine that that will overwhelm a person. However, it is when that overwhelmment continues outside of the context and persists that we start to say, okay, while the response was potentially protective and understandable, now it is creating distress and disturbance and functional impairment. It becomes a disorder. So let's take a moment to work from some definitions of trauma. Dr. Sue Johnson, who is the emotion focus guru, she described trauma as a wound or injury in the context of broken relationships. Susan Bannett, who is a clinical social worker, She defined it as a tragedy of enormous proportion and repercussion that is felt by the whole of the body. Dr. Peter Levine, who is a trauma specialist, explains trauma as the body's unsuccessful attempt to face a threat or injury. And then finally, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk defined it as the feeling of being unsafe in the body that creates an internal conflict by way of these visceral warning signs, like the physical symptoms that the body presents. When you are considering the story being described by your clients, hopefully you are listening for the complete and encompassing description in response to a feared stimuli. It is that encompassing description that helps you to determine whether or not what you are hearing meets the level of a person being overwhelmed and wounded in the body as a response. The beauty, I find, the beauty of trauma is that it is individualized. That means that it is that person's experience to a single or recurring incident that signifies if trauma has resulted, right? I want to let that sink in. Trauma gets its meaning based on the subjective experience of the person. Essentially, a trauma represents a mismatch between what happened and what the brain expected. Okay? The result to this challenge to cognitive schemas is a flooding experience. What are cognitive schemas? Cognitive schemas are how we make sense of the world. For instance, we might imagine that walking to our car in broad daylight is a safe activity, right? That's reasonable. However, if someone were to be attacked while walking to their car in broad daylight, that would be a challenge to that person's cognitive schema. So a trauma response is a mismatch, again, between what has happened and what the brain expected to happen and wasn't prepared for. Trauma, and I'll repeat this because I really think it's important, trauma is not credible because of the stimuli or the event, right? Somebody being beaten or a mass shooting or an assault. It is not the stimuli or the event that dictates if something is a trauma. Trauma gains credibility and legitimacy because of the person's reaction to the presumed danger, the threat, or the potential for threat. Okay? This is beautiful to me because people often feel like they have to prove to us that the situation that they're describing was enough to merit the reaction that they're having. For trauma, this is far from the truth. The example that I'll offer for this is the mass shooting in Vegas for those concert goers. It was many years ago, but it was the shooter in the window of one of the hotels. Some of those individuals in attendance for that concert went on to develop PTSD as a result of that mass shooting. Others did not, right? So just because it is a mass shooting, for instance, that is not what we say. Hence, this is a trauma, right? It is not the event, okay? So we can't insist that those that did not have PTSD had to because it was a mass shooting. right? We can't insist that those that did not have it actually have PTSD. We listen to what the client determines is their response. Whether the circumstance would overwhelm you as a therapist is really inconsequential, right? If it wouldn't overwhelm you, but it overwhelms the client, that is what matters. Understanding this particular perspective further enables us to lend merit to our client's issues, okay? Agreement is not required for therapeutic work, okay? I don't have to agree with what you say bothered, traumatized you, because it's not required for the definition. It is the client's subjective experience. As you are aware, I like to take historical deep dives to understand the progression of some of the diagnoses, psychology in general, but some of the diagnoses. Trauma is one of those issues that has transformed across the variations of the DSM. Trauma came on the DSM scene at the third version and was recognized to be a condition experienced by war veterans only. At the time, it was decided that those circumstances, here we go back to the circumstance being the most important element. At that time, it was decided that those circumstances, those war circumstances, were the only ones that could merit a trauma response. I mean, imagine that, right? Only war could create trauma. So we had names for it like shell shock or combat fatigue following the Vietnam War, right? So trauma was referred to in those ways, combat fatigue or shell shock. If you weren't in war, I don't know what we thought about a person being overwhelmed, but we didn't really consider that it was trauma. That was reserved for what we thought was the pinnacle of a traumatic event, and that being war. At the fourth iteration of the DSM, trauma was classified as an anxiety condition and was understood through a triad of symptoms. You had avoidance, hyperarousal, and flashbacks. That was the triad. Only adults in the fourth, and of course the third edition as well, but only adults were thought to be traumatized. And even though the DSM-4 had made progression beyond this just happening to war veterans, it didn't recognize the complex, cumulative, or even institutionalized nature of trauma, right? That something happening over and over again, even if not seemingly massive, could be traumatizing. With the DSM-5, it was considered that children could suffer with PTSD and that it represented a developmental course. So we continue to grow in our understanding, and we start to say there are probably experiences that are cumulative that happen, that came from the DSM-4, and now we say, you know what, I bet some of those cumulative things could be happening at any time, even during childhood, such that PTSD could present. It could be directly experienced, according to the DSM-5, it could be directly experienced or vicariously felt through witness, right? So this means I don't have to have been in the mass shooting per se, but if I witnessed it, I could also vicariously have some trauma. Because of the cumulative consideration, foundation was laid for understanding race-based trauma. Before the DSM-5, there was no name or explanation for the experiences of traumatized ethnic minorities. Instead, Such symptomatology was thought to be paranoid in mentation and without basis because all of the trauma was not necessarily personally experienced. Okay? There was far less consideration for the cumulative nature of distress. I want to pause there because I want us to go back in our minds and history and let's just consider slavery, for instance, the ongoing hundreds of years, like a couple of 100 years, decades of abuse, mistreatment. There was not consideration that that was trauma, right? Until the DSM-5. There was thought, well, they were fed, they were clothed, they were housed, sort of thing, right? Let's also think about our Native brothers and sisters. Their experiences until the DSM really weren't considered to reach the level of trauma, right? But it was institutionalized, as is racism in general, but it was an institutionalized trauma that was built into the laws and the ways of the land, right? But the DSM-5 opened us up to the large, the small, the cumulative, the indirect experiences of trauma that happen. If we look specifically at race-based trauma, it is not all directly experienced. In fact, it is trauma, it can be trauma that is experienced by association and group affiliation. It is passed down through oral history, storytelling, through the absence of significant caregivers, through separation, incarceration. It's witnessed as well, like occurs when we watch news stories or scroll social media. In addition to being explicitly induced, race-based trauma is also subversive in its presentation through microaggressions, let's say. Okay, so in some ways, race-based trauma is wholly subjective. So I emphasize again, it does not require consensual validation. Now, this runs counter to what BIPOC individuals often hear. Oftentimes, what is stated as a source of trauma or distress is challenged. For instance, are you sure that's what they meant? Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe are you overreacting? How could that make you feel like, and then fill in the blank, right? So oftentimes the challenge is overt and direct to send the message that another person disagrees with the subjective nature of distress of the person describing what happened. As therapists and those in the helping profession, we want to be certain not to challenge or seem to challenge the perspectives of our clients. We are not there to agree. We are there to hear the person's story and to help. When we challenge, that does not reflect a spirit of understanding, nor does it reflect a spirit of care. I'm honing in on this because it is not unusual for individuals to come in and share their story and for somebody to offhandedly say, oh, so that upset you, right? I'm putting it out there so that we can be mindful of the power of our words. As I alluded to already, trauma can be vicariously felt. In fact, as providers, we might experience secondary trauma from hearing the stories of our clients, right? We all understand and often give a head nod to secondary trauma, or is sometimes referred to as burnout, that is felt from first responders. Sadly, though, when the same explanations are rendered by BIPOCs and race-based trauma is presented, the stance is met with opposition and challenge often. Regardless of how the trauma is taken in or experienced directly or indirectly, the DSM-5 now allows for such indirect means, and we get to regard and respect this, full stop. Okay? I can't help but to mention the death of Mr. George Floyd here. Many persons viewed that incident involving the officer whose knee remained on Mr. Floyd's death long enough to, on Mr. Floyd's neck rather, long enough to result in his death. For many, the viewing of that video was overwhelming and created an experience of being traumatized. Right? I mention that not for any political means, but because it's one that I imagine most will have recollection of. The viewing of that by those of us in the community was traumatizing. When you think about how many times that matter was showed on social media, news outlets, of course, it was possible to be traumatized by this. If we can understand that about ourselves, if we can understand secondary trauma for first responders, for those who come on the scenes first, for crime scenes, to collect evidence, right? Graphic news reports, if we can understand that, we can have an openness for not only the subjective experience, but for the vicarious one as well. I mentioned the ACEs study, I think in class too, but I'm going to come back to it. The ACEs study was a 15-year longitudinal follow-up study. And this study evidences for us the cumulative effect of traumatic experiences on the psyche and the development of mental dis-ease. Okay? It highlighted how the single or repetitive experiences could cause a modification to the original genetic code by means of encouraging gene expression. In other words, epigenetics means that trauma can cause genes to turn off and on. One study showed that mice bred from fathers who had been trained to become afraid of a particular smell also showed avoidance of that same smell. I've given you in the hyperlink, I gave you the article. The current mouse or mice did not have to experience directly the innocuous smell to develop an avoidance to it. But the gene expression around that innocuous smell created a fear in the offspring mice. Okay, so it is cumulative and can even be relayed through genetic means, even if not indirect means. If an ancestor experiences a trauma through epigenetics, that trauma can produce reactions in subsequent generations. Okay, so I'm saying all of this so that we have an appreciation for trauma in all the ways that it can present. This tells us that the brain is mutable. It reflects what has happened to it either directly, vicariously, or generationally. So let's see what the DSM has to say about the diagnostic presentation of trauma and then stress-related disorders. The subtypes for trauma and stressor-related disorders are PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, adjustment disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and disinhibited social engagement disorder. Like other categories, there is also the unspecified and then the disorder. Unspecified trauma and stress-related disorder, other specified, and then the disorder, trauma and stressor-related disorder. As you might have noticed on the previous slide, the reactive attachment and disinhibited social engagement disorders were not asterisked. So I'm only going to review these briefly. While I hold these conditions to be important, they may be less often seen, or my opinion should be less often seen for a beginning clinician, even the PTSD, right? Even some of this trauma stuff, but should be less seen for a beginning clinician. So should you determine to focus your treatment specific to a child population, for instance, you'll want to ensure supervision for the specialized treatment that might be involved with these two disorders, reactive attachment and disinhibited social engagement disorder. Okay? Now, these two conditions, while not specifically touted as childhood trauma disorders, they are issues that are diagnosed in childhood. We've talked about and you've learned about attachment theory, not so much in this class. Like I had a slide or maybe 3 or 4 slides about it, but I knew you had gotten actual education about that. So you've learned about attachment theory and the importance of healthy attachment for sound relationship development. Going back to the definitions at the beginning, as Dr. Sue Johnson has defined trauma as a wound or injury, such is the case here with reactive attachment disorder. Such a disorder can develop and impact the child's ability to connect to others, particularly caregivers, but others too. But those attachments become impaired. The wounds, the injuries that have happened make attachment difficult. Due to the lack of trust and history with healthy adult caregivers providing secure care, there is an extreme emotional withdrawal from those who are supposed to care for the child. An outlay, a consequence from unreliable attachment figures is a minimization, a significant minimization in seeking comfort or responding to comfort when it is given. Such a child, or should a child rather, with reactive attachment disorder become distressed, there is a minimal likelihood that comfort would either be sought or even expected from an adult caregiver or anyone else. Bouts of sadness or irritability might be demonstrated unexpectedly and not prompted by an external event, okay? Essentially, I am describing for you reactive attachment and how it comes into being. Insufficient care is the cause, right? Insufficient care meaning deprivation, neglect of care or affection, right? All of this, not having adult caregivers who demonstrate care and protection and attachment creates a reactive attachment condition where attachment is no longer sought nor even considered possible. With attachment reactive disorder, this is going to be evident in a child before 5 years old. To me, that's a really sad circumstance to think about, that a child does not feel care and safety and trust, has not felt that from adults to the degree that they don't even expect it and may push it away should it be rendered in response to a distressing situation. Already, that sort of attachment protection, right, the avoidance of attachment has set in by 5 years old. Okay, that's reactive attachment. You can see in hearing my description how I think this is one of those disorders that really requires specific training for childhood development, and more training than I think is provided here, and supervision. More training here meaning this MFT program. The other disorder here is disinhibited social engagement, and it seems to be the opposite of the reactive attachment. Instead of absolute boundaries being erected emotionally, right? I don't seek, I don't even consider that attachment is possible. I don't seek it out. There seems to be no pause or hesitation in approaching unfamiliar adults. In fact, there is an over familiarity such that safety doesn't seem to be a consideration. So this is a child who's going up to individuals who they don't know and engaging, sort of attaching to them as if they could provide safety, trust, those sort of things, even when the person really is a known. Again, it's that lack of sufficiency in caregiving in all the ways, emotional, physical, affectional, that leads to a lack of recognition of adults providing safety, or in this instance, the lack thereof. You don't know them to be safe, but in this regard, it seems that there is not recognition that they could be unsafe either. There is no checking in with adults as a source of safety, right? Sort of looking back as children do. Children who are securely attached move out and explore from a secure base, right? They don't go too far. They look back. Is this okay? Am I going far enough, mommy? Or am I going too far? Okay, I'm not going to veer too far because my safety person is here, right? But here, with disinhibited social engagement disorder, there really is no checking in with adults to make sure that this is okay. It almost seems like, to me, a desperation for adult contact, but without having vetted the adult in any way, because there is no standard for adult presence. Okay, that is disinhibited social engagement disorder and reactive attachment disorder. I hope that sort of clarifies these two conditions. Now let's talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD is the familiar diagnosis in this grouping. Like we had depression as the classic disorder for mood issues or depressive disorders. Here, the classic condition is PTSD. It's the one we're probably most familiar with. In order for a PTSD diagnosis, there has to have been exposure to a traumatic event where there was actual or witnessed death or serious injury or sexual violence. Here, the DSM is giving some indication to what is considered to be a traumatic event. Now, I know I indicated that it is subjective, and it is, but the parameters are that the person witnessed death, actual death, serious injury, or some sort of sexual violence. Okay, so there was actual or witnessed some sort of serious injury, sexual violence. That is the caliber of thing that the DSM suggests would meet the level of a traumatic event. But it also recognizes subjective descriptions. The exposure was direct or indirect, or it could be a learned behavior from repeat exposure to aversive elements, right? So as a result of this traumatic event, right, and the exposure, however it came, intrusive experiences are had. The intrusive experiences are going to be things like memories, dreams, nightmares, flashbacks, some distress at cues that remind of the trauma, or physiological reaction to the cues of the trauma, right? So either I startle or my breath catches at cues of the trauma, or I have some degree of distress otherwise. So for instance, let's say that a child was nearly kidnapped at a park. Okay, there is serious injury there. There is probably the sense of grave danger, what have you. A child might then have memories or nightmares of the park, right? If they were near the merry-go-round, if they have those anymore, if they were near the merry-go-round, they might have a physiological reaction or distress at seeing the cue being the objects at the park that were in the child's purview and mind at the time of the assault or the attack. Okay? In addition to those, there is a persistent need to avoid the traumatic stimuli. They're trying to avoid the memories or the thoughts or the feelings, or avoiding any external cue or reminder of the trauma. Let's go to the park. I don't want to go to the park, right? There's the attempt to avoid the cues that bring on the distress and the physiology. So again, you have the traumatic event, and then you have the reaction to it, the memories, the nightmares, the flashbacks, along with the distress at the cues. And then here, the attempt to avoid whatever might remind of the trauma. Thinking is also impacted along with mood changes, okay? A dissociative amnesia could develop in one's thoughts such that memories of the event are lost altogether, okay? Thoughts may shift about the world in general. The world is now unsafe. People can't be trusted. Those sort of cognitive changes. Or there may be distortions about what caused the trauma. Oh, I must have done something horrible or horrific to deserve that this thing happened. These are all of the mentations that can shift as a result of the trauma, or mood changes, right? Developed fear or anger or rage that develops in response. So now the person is carrying around what seems like a chip on their shoulder, right? Always seeming angry. PTSD, right? The usual diminished interest in usually enjoyed activities is present, as well as the diminished capacity to feel positive emotion. All of that gets wrapped up in the persistent shift in thinking and mood. Finally, there are going to be the appreciable or marked changes in arousal and reactivity to the traumatic event, like anger or irritability, the development of reckless behavior, startle, or hypervigilance. Okay? As per usual, we have the specifiers. One of those is going to be onset. We're going to indicate whether or not the onset was in a delayed fashion. So within 1 month to 6 months is allowed. If something comes on 4 months, 5 months, 6 months after, we are going to say that's a delayed onset, okay? The 1 month up to a 6 month. We're also going to indicate if depersonalization is happening. That means feeling detached from a person's own body, from one's own body, kind of like they're hovering and looking at their body from above, or derealization, which is the feeling of a dream-like state. Okay? So again, we expect that people are going to respond to the trauma within a short amount of time. Usually within a month, we're going to see this constellation of symptoms set in. But if it doesn't happen right away, we would specify whether or not there is delayed onset, whether or not there is depersonalization with the PTSD diagnosis, or derealization. So let's move on to acute stress disorder in this category of diagnoses. Acute stress disorder symptoms represent the PTSD symptoms that onset immediately. Okay, so you just heard me indicate that, within a month, we may see PTSD symptoms, but the PTSD symptomatology may onset immediately, like 3 days up to 1 month. Okay, so this precedes the onset time frame for a diagnosis of PTSD. Everybody doesn't present the entire constellation of symptoms right away, but some do. And if they do, we would say this is acute. It came on suddenly, okay? The diagnostic criteria are essentially the same. It's the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence, again, either directly or witnessed, something that's learned, or some repeat exposure. And you have the intrusive symptoms, you have the negative mood, the dissociative symptoms, derealization, depersonalization, avoidance, as well as the arousal. Finally, in this grouping of disorders, we have adjustment disorder. I want to make a distinction here. So at the beginning, you see that adjustment disorder criteria includes emotional and behavioral symptoms in response to a stressor. So I'm going to make a distinction between stressor or a stressful event and a traumatic event. One or a person is considered to be poorly adjusted with this disorder, specifically in the way of emotional and behavioral reaction to a stressor. The emphasis on stressor is because it is differentiated from the degree of a traumatic event. There is death, there is sexual violence, and those sort of things. We don't just call things like that, oh, that was a stressor. No, that was a traumatic event. So stressors are events akin to perhaps job loss or retirement or children going out to school, or maybe a natural weather event like a disaster. Those would be stressors. Now, something like a natural weather event, if that leads to massive destruction and death, okay, we're going to call that a traumatic event, okay? So we're differentiating what is meant by a stressor with an adjustment disorder. But in reaction to this stressor, significant distress is felt that is out of proportion to the stressor in that it causes the impairment. Okay, now remember that is required for all the disorders. The impairment is required. In addition, it is the out of proportion, the disproportionate reaction here that gets us an adjustment disorder. Importantly, when we are thinking about an adjustment, a poorly adjusted reaction, this is not bereavement. Bereavement is considered to be normal. So if an event happened, a stressor happened, the loss of someone, and a person is grieving, we believe that that is normal, that that is not going to qualify as a disorder. The constellation of symptoms don't represent another mental condition, okay? I'm going to emphasize that, and I'll go through that again when we get down to the differentiation of diagnoses. Finally, there is a 6-month window with this particular disorder. The symptoms are not present for more than 6 months after the stressor. Should that be the case, should the symptoms persist, another mental health condition might be diagnosed. Okay, so the specifiers here are related to mood and anxiety. So you might have an adjustment disorder with depressed mood, with anxious mood, mixed, meaning, and you would say mixed with anxiety and depression, or you could say with conduct disturbance, or conduct disturbance that also has the depression and the anxiety. Importantly, when we're talking about this specifier, the anxiety and the depression here, full criteria is not being met for one of those disorders. If we are noting full criteria for a depressive episode, instead of giving an adjustment disorder, we may just say this person, if they've met the depressive episode of the 2 weeks or more, and that constellation of symptoms, that what we're looking at is already a depressive disorder and not this poorly adjustment period that seems to have anxious or depressed features to it. Okay? The differentiation here, adjustment disorder is going to be less severe than an acute stress disorder. I say that because the thing that brings it on is also less severe. You have a traumatic event with an acute stress or even a PTSD disorder. An adjustment disorder is a stressful event, a stressor, but not a traumatic event. Okay, so adjustment disorder, we want to make sure that we differentiate it from an acute stress disorder, which, as a reminder, could precede a PTSD diagnosis, given its onset after the event, 3 days for acute stress to 1 month. Okay, so when we're looking at adjustment, something has happened, but the focus becomes on what is the something? How severe, magnificent is that something? Because that may differentiate an adjustment from an acute stress disorder. Okay, but again, the acute stress disorder could precede the PTSD because of the time frame. It could be a month before somebody develops a PTSD, but if symptoms onset immediately following, it could be acute stress disorder. Okay, so it's the timing of the onset as well as the severity of the preceding event. So, to put this in context for this particular disorder, again, a person could be experiencing usual life stressors, but respond disproportionately to the circumstance and then be given an adjustment disorder. However, after 6 months, if the symptoms persist, consideration needs to be made for whether or not another diagnosis is merited. If you've given an adjustment disorder with depressive features, after 6 months, either they have adjusted, or if the distress persists, perhaps they have developed something beyond that, like a depressive disorder of some sort, and then you might move them into that category. Remember, it could be other specified depressive disorder if you don't think full criteria is met for a major depressive episode, right? But if past the 6 months you're saying, yeah, this is a depressive episode, we're going to go with a major depressive disorder, for example.